Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, what I want to discuss is integrating a skillful approach to our practice with this idea of non-self. Now, many of us will know that one of the most distinctive teachings in all of Buddhism is this teaching of non-self, that there is no permanent, unchanging essence to who we are that continues through time. This is something I've done many videos on. I'll leave a link to a playlist down below if you haven't seen any of them or would like to know more. But one of the issues that comes up with this idea of non-self with many people, in particular people who are new to the Buddhist teaching or perhaps who haven't heard this particular aspect before, is that it can be somewhat unsettling. It can make us feel as though there's nobody at home. Or worse, it can make us feel as though there's nothing real or there's nothing that matters. And this is one of the reasons why the Buddha refused to answer a question put to him by the wanderer Vacchagotta when Vacchagotta asked the Buddha whether the self continued. If we cling to a permanent self as who we really are, then being told that there is no such permanence to who we are can seem, again, deeply unsettling. It can really unmoor us. It can lead to confusion and maybe even to despair. As the Buddha said, when Vacchagotta asked me whether the self does not survive, if I had answered that the self does not survive, Vacchagotta, who was already confused, would have got even more confused, thinking, it seems that the self that I once had no longer survives. So somebody in such a state might think that learning about non-self had somehow killed off who they really were. And that might lead again to despair, to confusion, to all kinds of really unfortunate and unskillful kinds of outcomes. And the Buddha's answer to, or decision not to answer Vacchagotta here, I think reveals something of a nuanced and important aspect to the Buddha's teaching on non-self. That is, that it was supposed to be an illustration of something that could lead us towards skillfulness, and that if it didn't do that, then we should, leave it behind for a moment. Because the Buddha's real view of the self is that it is always changing, and that therefore, since it is always changing and always changeable, it can be altered, it can be trained in certain directions that are more skillful than others. The self, for the Buddha, is a kind of a conventional construct. It's built up by the way we think, by the way we act, by the way we speak. And in many ways, in ordinary life, the way we use the concepts of self are unskillful. They lead to bad outcomes. For example, they lead to greed when we grasp the idea of self-aggrandizement. We think of a self as something that has to be aggrandized, has to be built up, has to be maintained by acquiring as much as we can. That is a greedy mindset that doesn't lead to good outcomes. Similarly, it can lead to this concept of the self, this ordinary, unskillful concept of the self, can lead to hatred when we think in terms of self-protection. We think somebody else is harming us or could harm us, and so we have to eliminate them. We have to promote hatred towards them so that we can be protected, so that our self can be built up against the threat that they apparently have towards me. But there are also skillful aspects to a concept of self that we can make use of if we're only aware of them. And indeed, that's, I would say, a lot of the point of Buddhist practice, is to make us aware of these skillful ways of framing our notion of self and of making use of them through time, through bolstering these concepts, these ideas, these emotions over a period of time. Now, my friend Jorge Seguel, who does meditation classes down in Chile and South America, and indeed on the internet around the world for a Spanish-speaking world, he asked me recently, a while back, to do a video on this kind of topic, on showing how we can integrate a skillful understanding of self with this idea of what's known as emptiness in the later tradition, emptiness of a permanent essential self. We might think that they're not compatible, that if we understand emptiness, then there's no role for a truly skillful notion of self, but that's not true, and indeed that's, I would say, runs against all of Buddhist teaching, indeed the teaching of the path itself. The great scholar of early Buddhism and practitioner, Bhikkhu Analayo, has written a whole book on compassion and emptiness, which I'll leave a link to down below in the notes, where he discusses the role of compassion in particular with, understood together with an emptiness practice. And indeed in much later Buddhism, there's, again, this kind of interweaving of these two kinds of strands of Buddhism together. So we might say that the Buddhist path has many aspects that lead us towards a more skillful dance with this notion of an impermanent self, this notion of a self that's always changing. So, for example, we may be aware that we act, that volitions make a difference, our actions make a difference. In particular, that we act through body, through speech, and through mind as well. This is one of the things the Buddha taught. Now, hearing that, we may think, well, how do I act through mind? After all, so much of what comes up in my mind, I'm not really responsible for, after all. I mean, just thoughts just pop into my mind, maybe horrible thoughts from sometimes. How can I be responsible for those? They aren't really volitions. Well, yes and no. Of course, we aren't responsible for the thoughts that pop into our heads now and then as they ordinarily do, but over a period of time, we can train ourselves towards having more skillful thoughts. In one early sutta, the Buddha discusses when he was a bodhisattva, that is, before he had become enlightened. And he says that as a young boy or a child, he realized that there were two kinds of thoughts. There were thoughts that were skillful and helpful and beneficial to him, and thoughts that were unskillful, that were unbeneficial, that were not helpful to him. And so he undertook a practice of building up the skillful ones and trying to minimize the unskillful ones. Now, of course, we can't simply force ourselves not to have harmful thoughts. We can't force ourselves not to think bad things. That just doesn't work. However, the point here is that over a long period of time, by coming to see directly, to come to understand directly that certain thoughts are not helpful to us, we can learn ways to take the power out of those thoughts and make them come up in our minds less often. And, of course, thoughts themselves are the basis of actions. They're the basis of speech. And so by taking the energy out of those thoughts, we're helping to take the energy out of unskillful ways of acting in the world. The sorts of things that might actually not only be harmful to us, but be harmful to people around us. And this process of promoting harmlessness in thought, in speech, and in action goes hand in hand with other similar practices that really help to ground that kind of approach to life. For example, the four what are called Brahma Viharas, or abodes of the deities, abodes of the gods. That is, kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Kindness being an attitude of friendliness towards the whole world, towards other beings, towards everybody. Compassion being the wish to minimize the suffering of those around us. Now this begins as a thought. In all cases, these begin as thoughts, as we've just said, but then compassion should be realized as well in actions to help, or speech and action, I should say, to help those, insofar as we can, help those who are undergoing difficulty. Sympathetic joy is the ability to be happy, to take pleasure in another person's benefit, another person's happiness. In other words, to sort of overcome our ordinary tendencies towards resentment, towards jealousy. Resentment and jealousy being really unskillful states that make our lives worse and through making our lives worse, make the lives of other people around us worse. And so if we can learn to overcome jealousy and resentment, we're going a long way towards skillfulness. And finally, equanimity, which is this ability to be equanimous in how we dole out the other kinds of beneficial emotions and actions. In other words, it's an attempt to overcome favoritism. Ordinarily, we tend to be favoritist in the other three. In other words, we're kind to some people, all of us are, but not to a whole bunch of other people. We're compassionate towards certain people, but not towards others. We have a sympathetic joy. We're joyful when our friends perhaps have something good happen to them, but when someone else does, then we're not so joyful. And so equanimity is the practice, and it's perhaps the deepest and hardest practice, is learning to extend these other three out to the whole world. And coming to see and understand the benefits of this kind of practice is the beginning of true wisdom. So this essence of non-self that we began with is understanding that the self isn't a fixed, determined entity that sort of started when we were born or continues throughout all of eternity or whatever, however we want to understand it, and that doesn't change. Rather, it's something that's always changing, that's mutable, that we can make of what we want. In later Buddhism, this idea that the self can come to wisdom is known as Buddha nature, this kind of essence of goodness within us that we can tap into. However, in early Buddhism, the self is understood rather as something that's completely mutable, that can be either good or bad, that we can make of what we wish. And yes, there is a potential in all of us for good, and that can be understood as what in later Buddhism is known as Buddha nature, this potential, but that we have to have that first glimmer of wisdom or be taught somehow in order to see it. And it's this understanding that the self is mutable that gives us this openness to the future that we can change into. And to that extent, kindness is this really the central practice here that we're talking about. I did an earlier video about just how central that practice is. I will leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like a refresher. It's a video from a while back. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, well, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, where we have lots of interesting things to give in return for your support. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.